Jake had been walking across the vast desert for hours, his boots crunching against the hot, dry sand. The sun hung high in the sky, casting a harsh light over the empty landscape. The heat seemed to stretch endlessly, making the desert look like a place where time itself slowed down. Jake had been on many expeditions, but this one felt different. His curiosity had brought him here, far from his home, to explore a region of the planet that few humans had dared to visit. The desert wasn't the most welcoming place, but Jake had always enjoyed the thrill of the unknown. He adjusted his backpack and took another step, his eyes scanning the horizon. There was something strange in the distance, something out of place. It was a dark shape against the golden dunes, like a shadow that didn't belong. Jake squinted, trying to make sense of it. He had heard rumors about strange happenings in this area, but he never thought he'd see it firsthand. The object in the distance didn't look like a natural formation. It wasn't a rock or a mirage. It was too smooth, too unnatural. With a sense of urgency, Jake quickened his pace. As he got closer, his heart began to race. The object was no longer a distant blur. It was real. He was standing in front of what appeared to be the remains of a crashed spaceship, half buried in the sand. Its hull was broken in places, and strange symbols marked the surface, symbols Jake didn't recognize. The ship had clearly been here for some time, but something about it felt wrong. It wasn't just abandoned. It looked like it had been left in a hurry. Jake's mind raced with questions. Who had this ship belonged to? How did it end up here in the middle of nowhere? He stepped closer, cautiously, inspecting the wreckage. The air felt thick, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. He had a feeling that whatever had brought him here wasn't just a random discovery. He moved around the wreckage, scanning for any signs of life. There was no smoke, no sign of fire. But something caught his eye. A faint movement in the debris. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Jake was sure of it. Someone, or something, was still alive inside the wreck. His heart skipped a beat as he rushed toward the opening. The ship was partially open, as if it had been torn apart by some force. Jake crawled through the gap, his breath quickening. Inside, the dim light of the desert sun filtered through the cracks in the hull, casting long shadows on the sand-covered floor. The wreck was a mess. Broken panels, twisted metal, and scattered equipment. But what caught Jake's attention wasn't the wreckage itself. It was the figure lying motionless near the back of the ship. At first, Jake thought it was just another part of the wreck, a pile of clothing or equipment. But then, as he drew closer, he realized it wasn't a pile at all. It was a person, or at least something that looked like a person. The figure was a woman. Her skin shimmered with a strange metallic hue, reflecting the dim light. Her eyes were closed, her body limp, and she was covered in dirt and sand. She was clearly injured. Jake knelt beside her, his hands trembling slightly as he reached out to check for a pulse. To his relief, he felt a faint but steady beat. She was alive, but barely. Her breathing was shallow, and her chest rose and fell with difficulty. Jake had no idea who or what she was, but he knew one thing: she needed help. He quickly unstrapped his water bottle from his belt and offered it to her, gently tilting her head to let the water flow into her mouth. She coughed weakly, then managed to take a few shallow sips, her eyes fluttering open for the briefest moment. But then, as if the effort was too much, her eyes closed again, and she slipped back into unconsciousness. Jake didn't hesitate. He couldn't just leave her here. He had to help her. Gently, he lifted her into his arms, careful not to hurt her more. Her body was cold, and he could feel the weight of her injuries in the way she hung limply in his arms. She was much lighter than he expected, as if her body had been drained of energy. The sun was setting, casting an eerie orange glow over the desert as Jake carried her out of the wreckage. The harsh desert winds had started to pick up, making the sand swirl around them like a living thing. Jake knew he couldn't stay here long. He had to find shelter before nightfall. The desert was deadly, and it would only get colder and more dangerous once the sun disappeared. With every step he took, he felt the weight of responsibility growing heavier. He didn't know who this woman was or what had happened to her, but he couldn't just abandon her. He had to get her to safety. As he walked, the thought crossed his mind. Who was she? Where had she come from? And most importantly, why had fate led him here, to this strange place, to find her? Jake's journey was about to take an unexpected turn, one that would change his life forever. The answers were out there, hidden beneath the desert sands, and Jake was determined to uncover them. Jake moved quickly, his mind racing as he carried the strange woman through the desert. The sun had almost set, and the temperature was beginning to drop. He knew he had to find shelter for the night, but the vast expanse of sand around him offered little protection. With each step, he wondered who she was and what had happened to her. The ship she had come from was clearly damaged, and whatever had caused the crash seemed to have left its mark on her. He finally spotted a small cave in the distance, nestled against a rocky outcrop. The dark opening looked like the perfect place to rest for the night. As he approached the cave, Jake felt a sense of relief wash over him. He carefully set the woman down inside, making sure she was as comfortable as possible. The cave was cool and sheltered from the wind, and Jake immediately set to work gathering some dried brush to start a small fire. As the flames flickered to life, Jake sat beside the woman, his eyes scanning her face for any signs of improvement. Her skin had a soft, almost metallic sheen to it, and her features were delicate yet strong. She was unlike anyone Jake had ever seen before. Her alien appearance only added to the mystery surrounding her. He needed answers, and he hoped she would wake soon enough to provide them. After what felt like hours, the woman's eyes slowly opened. At first, her gaze was unfocused, her eyelids fluttering as she tried to take in her surroundings. She blinked, her eyes adjusting to the light of the fire. Then, as if sensing Jake's presence, her gaze locked onto him, and a soft gasp escaped her lips. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice weak but clear. There was an unfamiliar accent in her words, one Jake couldn't place. "My name is Jake," he said softly, trying not to startle her. "I found you in the wreckage of your ship. You were hurt, so I brought you here to help." The alien woman blinked again, her brow furrowing in confusion. She opened her mouth to speak, but then stopped, as if struggling to find the right words. Jake waited patiently, giving her time. "I thank you," she finally managed, her voice still shaky. "You saved my life. But how? You're human. How is it possible?" Jake wasn't sure how to respond. The question itself surprised him. He had never thought about it that way. All he knew was that he couldn't leave her to die in the desert. "I don't know," Jake admitted. I couldn't leave you there." The woman took a deep breath, seeming to gather strength. She reached out, her hand trembling slightly as she touched the sand in front of her. She looked up at him with a mix of gratitude and something else, something Jake couldn't quite place. It was as if she was studying him, trying to make sense of his actions. "I'm Zora," she said, her voice steadier now. I am not like you. I come from a far-off planet, one that is very different from yours. My people, we were sent to explore your world, but our mission was interrupted. We were attacked by an enemy we didn't expect. Our ship, it was destroyed." Jake listened intently, his curiosity growing. He had no idea what she meant by "explore your world," but the mention of an enemy made him uneasy. It explained the wreckage he had found earlier. Zara's people had been in danger long before Jake had stumbled upon her. "Attacked?" Jake asked, his voice tense. "Who attacked you? What happened?" Zara closed her eyes for a moment, as if lost in painful memories. "I don't know. They were fast, too fast. We didn't even see them coming. I'm the only one left. The others, they didn't survive. I was the only one who managed to escape the wreckage." Jake's heart sank. He had seen the devastation of the crash, and it made sense now why Zara had been so weak. Her survival was nothing short of a miracle. "I'm sorry," Jake said softly. That's awful." Zara shook her head, her gaze distant. "There is more," she said, her voice tight. "The people who attacked us, they're not just a threat to my kind. They are dangerous. They come for anyone they can. And now they will come for me." Jake's brow furrowed. "What do you mean? Why would they come for you?" "I am not just anyone," Zara replied, her eyes flashing with something fierce. "I am the daughter of a high-ranking official on my planet. My capture would mean more than just my death. It would be a message, a symbol of power. They would use me to control my people." Jake could feel the weight of her words. She wasn't just an innocent traveler lost in the desert. Zara's survival was tied to something much bigger, something that threatened more than just her life. "You need to get out of here," Jake said urgently. "If they're after you, we can't stay here. We need to find somewhere safe." Zara nodded, her expression grave. "I know, but I can't do it alone. I need help. And you are the only one who can help me now." Jake was taken aback. Help her? What could he, a simple human from Earth, possibly do to help an alien princess? But something in her eyes, something in the way she looked at him, made Jake feel like he couldn't turn his back on her. He had saved her life, and now she was asking for his help. He didn't know where this journey would take them, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't about to leave her stranded in the desert again. "Okay," Jake said, his voice firm. "I'll help you. But we need to get moving. We can't stay here." Zora's eyes softened, and a small, thankful smile appeared on her face. For the first time since Jake had found her, she seemed to believe there was a chance for survival. Together, they would face whatever came next, no matter how dangerous. As the night wore on, the desert around them grew colder. The fire in the small cave crackled, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Jake had made a small meal from his supplies, and he sat across from Zara, watching her carefully as she ate. She was still weak, but the food seemed to help. Slowly, the color was returning to her face, though her eyes still held a distant sadness. Jake, on the other hand, was restless. He kept glancing outside the cave, as if expecting someone, or something, to appear. He had never been this far into the desert before, and the thought of enemies closing in on them made him uneasy. His instincts told him they couldn't stay here for long. The desert wasn't a forgiving place, especially at night when the temperature dropped so drastically. Zara, noticing Jake's concern, spoke softly, her voice still hoarse from the crash. "You're right. We cannot stay here." Jake turned to her, surprised. "You knew?" Zara nodded, her eyes focused on the shadows outside. "This place is too exposed. If they come for me, we won't survive here. We need to move before they find us." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. He had no idea who they were up against, but Zara's words had a finality to them. It was clear she wasn't afraid to face danger, but Jake wasn't sure he was ready for what lay ahead. "Where do we go?" Jake asked, his voice steady despite his growing anxiety. Zara hesitated for a moment, then pointed towards the distant horizon. "There is a place, a hidden base. It's far from here, but it's the safest place I know. We can rest there, plan our next move." Jake looked out into the darkness. He knew the desert stretched for miles, with no signs of civilization in sight. The idea of walking through it in the middle of the night seemed impossible, but he didn't have a choice. If Zara was right, staying here meant certain death, and if there was even the slightest chance that her hidden base could keep them safe, he was willing to try. He stood up and stretched, feeling the weight of the journey ahead settle onto his shoulders. The fire was dying down, and the cold winds were picking up. "Let's get moving then," Jake said, his voice resolute. Zara stood too, her body still weak, but her expression determined. She took a deep breath, then nodded. "We have no time to waste." As they left the shelter of the cave and stepped into the desert night. The first thing Jake noticed was the stillness. The wind had died down, and the only sound was the crunch of sand beneath their feet. It felt surreal, as if the desert itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Zara led the way, moving with a grace that belied her injuries. Her steps were steady, even though Jake could see that her energy was still low. He kept close behind her, watching her every move. He knew she wasn't just some random alien. There was something special about her, something that made him want to protect her, even though he didn't fully understand why. They walked in silence for a while, the desert stretching out before them like an endless sea of sand. The stars above were bright, casting a soft glow over the landscape. It was beautiful, in a way, but also desolate. Jake couldn't help but feel small under the vastness of the sky, especially with the weight of Zara's life hanging in the balance. "How far is this base of yours?" Jake finally asked, breaking the silence. Zara didn't answer immediately. She seemed lost in thought, her eyes scanning the horizon. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "It's not just a base. It's a refuge for my people, a place where we can hide from the ones who want to destroy us." Jake was quiet for a moment, processing her words. "And these people, who are they? Why are they after you?" Zara's face darkened as she replied, "They are not just enemies. They are conquerors, and they have been hunting my kind for years. They want control, power, and my people. We've never been a threat to them. We just want to live in peace, but that's not what they want." Jake could hear the pain in her voice, and for a moment, he felt a pang of sympathy. Zara had been through so much already, and the danger she was facing was far greater than anything he could imagine. Yet here she was, fighting to survive in a foreign world, trusting a human she barely knew. "I'm sorry," Jake said quietly. "I wish I could do more to help." Zara looked back at him, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "You are helping. You're still here, aren't you? Most people would have run by now." Jake chuckled softly. "Well, I guess I'm not most people." They continued walking, the journey ahead of them uncertain but necessary. They had no maps, no guides, just each other and the hope that they could make it to this so-called refuge before it was too late. The desert seemed endless, its sand dunes rolling like waves, making it feel like they were walking in circles. Hours passed, and Jake's legs began to ache, but he didn't complain. Zara's strength seemed to be waning, but she kept moving forward, her focus never wavering. Jake admired her determination. She was tougher than anyone he had ever met, and it made him wonder just how much more strength she had hidden inside her. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Zara stopped and pointed ahead. "We're close now, just a little further." Jake's heart skipped a beat. They might actually make it. But just as hope began to bloom inside him, the distant sound of engines reached his ears. Zara froze, her eyes narrowing. "They found us." Jake's stomach twisted into knots. The enemies Zara had spoken of were here, and they were closing in. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as the sound of engines grew louder, echoing across the vast desert. Zara's face hardened, her eyes flashing with a mix of fear and determination. She had warned him this could happen, but hearing the noise so close made it feel all too real. "They're coming," she whispered, her voice tight. "We need to move. Now." Jake didn't need to be told twice. His mind raced as he turned to look for a place to hide, but the desert stretched out endlessly in every direction, offering no cover. The sound of the engines was unmistakable. There was no doubt in his mind that whoever was chasing them was getting closer by the second. "Can you run?" Jake asked urgently, his eyes scanning Zara's exhausted form. Zara nodded, but there was a certain weariness in her movements that didn't go unnoticed. She wasn't as strong as she had been earlier. The journey through the desert had taken its toll, and Jake could see the strain in the way she moved. "I can run," Zara said, her voice firm despite the fatigue in her eyes. "But we can't outrun them forever. We need a plan." Jake nodded, his mind working quickly. He thought about the surroundings, but there was little to work with. They were out in the open, with no shelter in sight. The only option was to keep moving and try to find a way to outsmart their pursuers. "Okay," Jake said, his voice steady. "We'll keep moving, but we need to stay ahead of them. If we can find somewhere to hide, we might be able to hold them off." Zara gave him a sharp look. "There's nowhere to hide in this desert, Jake, but there's something I can do." She reached into a small pouch on her belt and pulled out a strange device, one Jake hadn't seen before. It was sleek and metallic, with glowing blue markings on its surface. She pressed a button, and the device hummed softly in her hand. "What is that?" Jake asked, his curiosity piqued. "A distress signal," Zara explained. "It's a signal to call for help from my people. It's been hidden, and they'll know how to reach us." Jake's eyes widened. "You mean we're going to try to call for backup? Out here?" Zara nodded. "It's our only chance. If I can get the signal out, my people will hear it. They'll come for us. But we have to move fast." The sound of the engines grew louder, and the ground seemed to vibrate under their feet as the vehicles drew closer. Jake didn't have time to argue. They had to act. "Let's go," Jake said, grabbing her arm gently. "We'll find a spot to hide, and you can use that device." They started running, their feet kicking up the hot sand as they moved as quickly as they could. The desert stretched before them, endless and barren, but Jake knew they couldn't stop. They needed to get to a place where Zara could use the device without being seen. For what felt like an eternity, they ran, their breaths coming in shallow gasps. The engines were still close, but Jake couldn't turn around to check. He had to trust that Zara knew where they were going. Finally, after what seemed like hours, Zara stopped and pointed to a large rock formation ahead. It was tall and jagged, offering some cover from view. Jake didn't hesitate. They ran toward it, their pace quickening as they neared the shelter of the rocks. Once they were behind the rock formation, Zara pulled out the device again and began pressing buttons. The blue lights on the device flickered as she adjusted its settings. Jake kept watch, his heart racing as the sounds of the engines grew even closer. They were almost there. "Please work," Zara muttered under her breath, her hands trembling slightly as she worked. Jake couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. They were running out of time. If Zara's signal didn't reach her people, they'd be trapped in the desert with no way out. The desert was unforgiving, and Jake knew it would only get worse as the night wore on. The engines roared louder, and Jake felt his muscles tense. The enemy was right behind them. But then, just as the sound of the engines reached its peak, the device in Zara's hand emitted a sharp, high-pitched sound. The blue lights on it pulsed brightly, and Zara looked up at Jake with a mix of relief and exhaustion. "It's done," she said quietly. "Now we wait." Jake didn't know if he should feel hopeful or nervous. They had sent the signal, but whether or not help would arrive in time was still a mystery. As they crouched behind the rocks, they listened to the engines drawing closer. The vehicles came to a stop just a few hundred yards away, and Jake could hear the voices of the pursuers shouting orders, their language unfamiliar but full of anger. They were searching the area, trying to find where Zara and Jake had gone. Jake's heart pounded as he watched the figures move through the sand. He tried to remain as still as possible, hoping they wouldn't spot him or Zara behind the rocks. Every second felt like an eternity, the tension thick in the air. Then, just as the voices grew louder, and it seemed like their pursuers were about to discover their hiding spot, a low hum filled the air. Jake's head snapped up in surprise as a bright light appeared in the sky, moving fast toward them. Zara's eyes widened, and she grabbed Jake's arm. "They're here." The hum grew louder, and the light intensified as a ship appeared overhead, descending swiftly toward the ground. The enemy's voices grew frantic as they looked up in disbelief. Help had arrived. Zara's people were here to save them. The sound of the approaching ship grew louder, its engines humming steadily as it descended from the sky. Jake's heart raced as the light from the ship bathed the desert in an almost unnatural glow. Zara's grip on his arm tightened, her face a mixture of relief and concern. She knew help had arrived, but there was still a danger in the air. The enemy wasn't far behind, and the ship's arrival could either be their salvation or the final nail in their coffin. Jake stood frozen, watching the ship's descent with a sense of awe. He had never seen anything like it. The ship was sleek, its surface shimmering like metal, but with a strange, almost liquid quality. It wasn't like anything he'd ever seen in Earth's technology, and it was clear that it was far beyond anything he could comprehend. But for now, it didn't matter. What mattered was that it had come. As the ship neared the ground, the enemy voices grew frantic, their orders shouted in frustration. They clearly hadn't expected anyone to intervene. Zara's people were here, and they were about to fight for their survival. Zara pulled Jake down further behind the rocks, her eyes locked on the descending ship. "Stay here," she whispered urgently. "Stay hidden. Let me go first." Jake opened his mouth to protest, but Zara placed a finger on his lips, silencing him. "You're human," she said softly, her voice full of emotion. "You can't be seen. You're the only chance I have." Jake hesitated. He didn't want to leave her, didn't want to be helpless while she faced danger alone. But Zara's words hit him hard. She wasn't just an alien to him anymore. She had become something more, someone worth fighting for. But he had no choice. Zara was right. If she didn't get to her people first, they wouldn't stand a chance against their pursuers. Reluctantly, Jake nodded and stepped back further into the shadows, his eyes never leaving Zara's face. She gave him one last, reassuring smile before turning and sprinting toward the ship, her figure a blur against the dark desert sands. The enemy, still searching the area, hadn't noticed her movement. But the moment she ran, the loud engines of the ship cut through the air, and a burst of light shot from the craft, striking the ground near the pursuers. The blast wasn't meant to kill, just to stun, but it sent the attackers scattering in confusion. Zara's people were here, and they weren't playing around. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he crouched behind the rocks, holding his breath. He could see Zara's figure now, standing tall beside the ship. Two figures emerged from the craft, their silhouettes sharp against the light. They were tall and armored, their expressions hidden behind sleek helmets. The desert wind howled around them, but they didn't seem to care. They moved with purpose, swiftly approaching Zara. "Zara," one of the figures called out, his voice muffled by his helmet, but unmistakably relieved. "You're safe." Zara nodded, her shoulders relaxing for the first time since Jake had met her. "I made it. They were close, but I've made it." She looked back at the group of pursuers who were still recovering from the stun blast, their weapons drawn. "They're dangerous. They won't stop until they have me." The figure who had spoken, a large alien male with dark, reflective armor, took a step forward. "We know. We've been tracking them for weeks. They'd been hunting you, Zara, but not anymore." Zara's gaze softened as she looked back at Jake, still hidden behind the rocks. She took a deep breath before turning back to the two figures. "I couldn't have made it here without him." The two figures exchanged glances. "Without him?" The second figure, a female with silver armor, asked in surprise. "You brought a human here?" Zara nodded. "He saved me. He's the reason I'm alive. He's done more for me than anyone ever has." Her voice wavered with emotion, and Jake could see the weight of her words in her eyes. She wasn't just grateful for the help. She trusted him. She saw something in him that no one else had. Jake felt a rush of warmth at her words, but it was quickly replaced by a surge of uncertainty. What would happen now? Would Zara's people accept him? Would they see him as an ally or an obstacle? "We need to move now," the male figure said, his voice stern. "The enemy is regrouping. We can't stay here much longer." Zara turned back to Jake, her eyes filled with determination. "Come with me, Jake. You've done enough to help me." Now, let me help you." Jake was taken aback. He hadn't expected this. He had just been trying to survive, to help Zara because it felt like the right thing to do. But now she was offering him something more. She was offering him a chance to be part of something bigger, to be part of her world. He stood up from behind the rocks, stepping into the open, and slowly walked toward the ship. He wasn't sure what to expect, but one thing was clear. His life had changed forever the moment he had found Zara in the desert. He had never imagined that his actions would lead him to this point. He had never imagined being part of a bigger story, a story that was far beyond anything he had ever known. As he approached Zara and the two alien figures, he felt a sense of purpose grow inside him. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew he would face it with Zara by his side. They had come this far together, and he wasn't going to let anything separate them now. The male alien took a step forward, his eyes sizing Jake up, then nodded approvingly. "We'll need you, human," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "We'll need everyone who is willing to fight." Zara looked at Jake, her gaze full of gratitude and something deeper. "Together," she said softly, "we can make it through this." Jake nodded, feeling a sense of resolve fill him. He wasn't just helping Zara anymore. He was fighting alongside her, standing by her side as they faced the unknown. Whatever dangers lay ahead, he would face them with her, and they would survive, together. The hum of the ship's engines filled the air as Zara, Jake, and the two figures from the ship moved swiftly across the desert. The ship had landed just beyond the rocky outcrop, and now they were making their way to it, Zara leading the way with Jake close behind. The air was still cold, but the warmth of the ship's engines was a welcome relief after the long, exhausting trek across the desert. Zara had spoken to the two figures, both of whom had introduced themselves as members of her people's elite forces. The male was named Rokar, a towering figure with dark armor and an air of authority. The female was Lyra, smaller but no less formidable, her eyes sharp and calculating as she observed their surroundings. Jake couldn't help but feel out of place among them, a mere human in the company of such powerful and skilled individuals. But Zara had insisted on him coming with them. Her people had no love for humans, at least not the ones who had invaded their planet years ago. But Jake's actions had earned her trust, and that trust was enough for him to be included in the mission ahead. As they approached the ship, the ground beneath them suddenly shook. Jake's breath caught in his throat as the distant sound of engines roared back to life. He spun around, his heart racing. The enemy was closer than he had feared. Zara's face tightened as she looked to the horizon. "They followed us," she said, her voice low and tense. "We don't have much time. We need to leave. Now." Rokar and Lyra exchanged a quick glance. Without another word, they moved into action, their movements fluid and precise. Jake didn't have to ask what they were doing. They were ready for this. They had known the risks from the beginning. "Get inside," Rokar ordered, his voice commanding. "We'll take care of the rest." Zara grabbed Jake's arm and pulled him toward the ship. "Come on, we can't waste time." They rushed up the ramp into the ship, and the door slammed shut behind them with a loud hiss. Inside, the ship was a blur of high-tech controls and sleek, futuristic design. Jake had never seen anything like it. The walls were lined with glowing panels, and the air inside was cool, almost sterile. It was nothing like the cramped, dusty ships of Earth. This was the kind of technology Zara's people had created, a far cry from what humans had managed to achieve. Zara immediately moved to the front of the ship, where a series of consoles flickered with activity. "I'm going to need help navigating," she said, her tone focused. "Can you handle the controls?" Jake stared at her in disbelief. "You want me to fly this thing?" Zara's eyes softened. "You've already helped me in ways I never expected. I trust you." She looked at him with a mixture of determination and vulnerability. "Please." Jake hesitated. He didn't know the first thing about flying a ship like this, but Zara had always believed in him. She trusted him with her life, and in that moment, Jake knew there was no turning back. If he was going to be a part of this, he would have to step up. "Okay," Jake said, his voice shaky but resolute. "I'll do my best." Zara showed him the basic controls, her fingers quick and sure as she guided him through the commands. The ship hummed to life as Jake followed her instructions, his hands trembling slightly as he pushed buttons and adjusted levers. He had no idea what he was doing, but he had to trust his instincts. Outside, the sounds of enemy ships closing in were deafening. The enemies had arrived in full force, their ships larger and more intimidating than anything Jake had seen before. The desert was no longer a quiet, empty place. It was a battlefield. "Hold tight," Zara warned as she input a few more commands. The ship's engines roared to life, and Jake felt a sudden jolt as they took off into the sky, the desert below them shrinking rapidly. He couldn't help but glance out the window at the massive enemy ships closing in on them. They were being pursued, but for now, they were escaping. But Zara's expression didn't relax. "They'll follow us," she said grimly. "They won't stop until they have me." Jake could see the fear in her eyes, despite the determination she tried to hide. He understood now. The stakes were far higher than he had imagined. This wasn't just about survival anymore. Zara's people were at war, and she was a key player in that fight. Her enemies weren't just after her. They wanted everything she represented. Rokar and Lyra were in the back, monitoring the incoming ships. They were preparing for the worst, knowing the enemy wouldn't let them go easily. Jake could feel the tension building in the air. They were far from safe, and the hardest part of their journey was just beginning. As the ship rocketed through the sky, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that everything had changed. He had entered a world far beyond anything he had known, and there was no going back. The threat that had once seemed so distant was now very real, and there was no turning away from it. Zara turned to him, her gaze intense. "Thank you, Jake," she said softly. "You don't know how much this means to me. To all of us." Jake gave a small nod, his throat tight. "I'm just doing what I can," he replied, though he didn't feel entirely sure of that anymore. This was more than just helping someone. He had been pulled into something much larger, something that would test him in ways he couldn't yet understand. The ship shot through the atmosphere, the desert far below them, now a fading memory. But Jake knew that whatever lay ahead, he would face it with Zara by his side. She had given him a chance to be part of something greater, and he wasn't about to let her down. The ship soared through the atmosphere, the vastness of space stretching out before them. The desert planet that had been their battleground was now a distant blur, shrinking rapidly as the ship accelerated toward safety. Inside, Jake felt a strange mix of relief and uncertainty. He had made it off the desert alive, but what now? What had he gotten himself into? Zara sat next to him, her expression focused but calm, as if she had done this 1,000 times before. The fear that had once gripped her was now replaced by a quiet determination. She wasn't just a survivor anymore. She was a leader, and Jake could feel the weight of that responsibility hanging over her. "Where are we going?" Jake finally asked, breaking the silence that had settled between them. He had been so focused on getting away from the pursuers that he hadn't thought about where they were heading next. Zara turned to him, her gaze steady. "To my people. We have a hidden base, far from here. It's where we can regroup and plan our next move." Jake nodded, trying to absorb everything she had said. He had barely wrapped his mind around the fact that he was now in space, on a ship that wasn't even from Earth, and being chased by enemies who wanted Zara for reasons he didn't fully understand. And now, they were heading to a hidden base, a place that could offer them safety, but also more questions than answers. "What happens when we get there?" Jake asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "What do you need me to do?" Zara looked at him with a small smile, her eyes softening. "You've already done more than enough. But when we get there, we'll need your help. My people need to know that we're not alone, that there are humans who are willing to stand with us, not against us." Jake's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected that. He was just a regular guy from Earth. He wasn't a soldier, or a diplomat, or anything important. Yet Zara was asking him to be a bridge between their worlds. "Are you sure about that?" Jake asked, his voice quiet. "I'm just a guy from Earth. I don't know anything about fighting or politics or anything like that." Zara's smile widened, and she placed a hand on his arm, her touch reassuring. "You've already shown me something more important than any training or experience: courage. You didn't hesitate to help me when you had no idea what I was, or what you were getting into. You took action when it mattered, and that's what we need." Jake didn't know what to say. He had never seen himself as brave or special. But in that moment, looking at Zara, he realized something. Helping her wasn't about being a hero. It was about doing the right thing, even when it was hard. And he couldn't walk away from that. The ship's engines hummed steadily as they traveled through space. The stars outside the windows were endless, and Jake felt like he was floating in a world of possibilities. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time since meeting Zara, he felt like he was part of something bigger than himself. A mission, a purpose, a new beginning. After a long silence, Zara spoke again, her voice quieter this time. "Jake, I want to thank you again. You've saved my life more times than I can count. You've made a difference, and I don't know if I'll ever be able to repay you." Jake looked at her, his heart swelling with emotion. "You don't have to repay me," he said softly. "I did what anyone would have done. I'm just glad you're safe." Zara smiled, but there was a depth to her gaze that made Jake feel like she understood something about him that no one else did. It wasn't just about saving lives. It was about connecting with someone, about sharing a journey, even when that journey was uncertain. As they flew through the vastness of space, the ship's sensors suddenly beeped, a series of flashing lights filling the room. Zara's hand flew to the controls, her expression turning serious. "We're approaching the base," she said, her voice calm but focused. Jake leaned forward, his heart racing again. He had no idea what to expect. Would her people welcome him, or see him as a threat? Would they trust him, or would they view him as an outsider who didn't belong? The uncertainty was overwhelming, but it was nothing compared to the fear of being stranded in the desert without Zara. They had made it this far, together, and that gave him hope. As the ship descended toward the hidden base, Jake could see the outline of a large structure beneath them, surrounded by mountains and dense forests. It looked like a place that had been carefully hidden, a place where Zara's people could regroup and plan their next moves. The ship landed smoothly, its engines powering down as the door opened with a soft hiss. A cool breeze greeted them as they stepped outside, and Jake took a deep breath, the scent of fresh air filling his lungs. It felt different here, peaceful, almost. Zara turned to him, her eyes shining with determination. "Welcome to our home, Jake. This is where we'll start our fight." Jake looked around, his heart pounding in his chest. He had come a long way from the man who had stumbled upon a crashed ship in the desert. Now, standing on this hidden world with Zara and her people, he knew one thing for sure: his life would never be the same again. They walked together into the base, ready to face whatever challenges awaited them. The journey ahead would be long, and the stakes would be high, but with Zara by his side, Jake felt ready for whatever the future held. He wasn't alone anymore, and together, they would fight for a better tomorrow.